Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining us this evening. On behalf of the Center for Policy Research and the Energy Research Institute, we're really pleased to welcome you to an event which we've titled "What Are Countries Doing to Mitigate Climate Change? An Interaction with IPCC Authors." We are really delighted today to have the opportunity to host this conversation. And in holding this event, we are taking advantage of a really unique opportunity, which is the presence in Delhi of the authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, Working Group 3, which is the working group on mitigation. The IPCC, as many of you know, was set up to provide policymakers regular scientific assessments on climate change, in the case of Working Group 3, particularly on the mitigation of climate change. So having the authors in our city gives us a really rare opportunity to talk to some of the leading minds and some of the leading thinkers on this important issue, and to interact and engage with them. So we really hope that you'll keep your questions and your powder dry and interact with the group robustly. Having been part of conversations for the last few days, I can testify to the fact that we're all used to robust engagement. So look forward to this conversation. My name is Navroz Dubash. I'm a professor at the Center for Policy Research and a coordinating lead author of the chapter on national policies and institutions as part of Working Group 3. And my co-convener, Ritu Mathur, is a senior fellow at TERI and is a lead author in the chapter on on mitigation and development pathways in the near to midterm. So the two of us really took the opportunity to persuade our colleagues to spend an evening with the broader community. I think they will benefit from the interaction, and I really hope that all of you will as well. We're going to keep this event as interactive as possible. The plan of the day is quite straightforward, which is that we're going to first have some opening remarks, and then we will have an interaction with the panel, and we will make sure that we spend a good chunk of time on interaction with all of you. To open this event, I'm very, very pleased to first welcome Professor Jim Skee, who is the Working Group 3 co-chair and also a professor of sustainable energy at Imperial College London. Professor Skee is the one who sort of coordinates and herds us during these author interactions, as well as keeps the atmosphere lively and challenging. Professor Skee has held a number of academic appointments at the University of Sussex, at Carnegie Mellon University, at Cambridge University. He's been, of course, in addition to being co-chair of Working Group 3, he's been involved in the IPCC in a number of capacities, including with the recent, very widely discussed report on 1.5 degrees. He also has a very important role in his home country, in the UK, as a member of the UK's Committee on Climate Change, which is an extremely interesting innovation in climate governance. And in Scotland, he is chair of the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission, which focuses on labour market and skills needed to facilitate a transition from a low-carbon economy. So he's also very familiar with some of the complex social challenges of low-carbon development. He made me promise not to go on at length, but I do have to mention he has a CBE and an OBE for his services to his country. So I'm very, very grateful on behalf of Ritu and myself to welcome you here, Jim, and look forward to a few words of introduction.
Okay, thanks very much, Navros. And I should just say that the task of co-chairing the Working Group 3 on herding the cats is shared with my colleague, Professor Shukla from Ahmedabad University. I call it herding cats, he calls it herding tigers, and you can see the people there. So we have got great hospitality this week from the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change, who have facilitated the meeting at the Taj Hotel. And just to say, we're very pleased that the Centre for Policy Research and TERI have joined them in welcoming us to Delhi. I just want to say that the authors, they're still awake, but they've been enormously busy for the last year, because just in the last 12 months, IPCC has approved 3 special reports on global warming of 1.5 degrees, on climate change in land in August, and on oceans and cryosphere and climate change just over a week ago. and that's as well as another report on inventory methodologies. And they were all very laborious. Most of them went through the night on the final session, so you can see the degree of passion that was engaged between the policymakers and the scientists to get all these products on the market, as it were. Now, it's really good to see the authors here. I mean, but they're not just scientists, because these people in their own countries are often quite well connected into policy processes, which gives them a good opportunity to talk here. And as IPCC authors, they're under the requirement to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. But as the IPCC logo does not appear on this screen, it's just the Centre for Policy Research and Terry. They are off the leash, and they can be much franker, I think about what they can say. This is not an official IPCC event, so they can certainly move on that. But just to say, I mean, one thing that's very obvious, that there is a very large gap between the kind of aspirations that countries set out in the Paris Agreement and the kind of status of policies and plans that are in place at the moment. And that's across all the aims of the Paris Agreement. But it is good to see that many countries are making progress and beginning to put in place the kind of the policies and plans that will help to close that gap. And I don't want IPCC authors to claim too much credit for it, but we heard very much from Secretary Mishra a couple of days ago about what India is doing in terms of helping to close that gap. And when we had another lead author meeting 6 months ago in my home country in Scotland, and again a lot has been happening there. Just last week, Scotland actually introduced a new Act of Parliament, which was for net zero by 2045. That is to completely remove emissions, and I understand it was actually reported here on India. And it's also been backed up by a set of fairly comprehensive policies in the programme for government for the next year that the Scottish Government has just released. And it's a very interesting programme for government because it has 4 sections to it. And the first section is called Ending Scotland's Contribution to Climate Change, which is the user-friendly way of describing net zero emissions or a balancing between greenhouse gas emissions and sinks. And there are many specific measures to back that up. For example, banning fossil fuels for any new homes built after the year 2040, 100% renewables for meeting electricity demand, and a big investment in electric vehicle charging, plus a new circular economy bill that will help to back up some of the materials issues there. Now, I'm not going to say much more about it. I mean, you're going to hear an excellent set of expertise, from the authors that we've got here. But I just wanted to pick up what Navros said about my role with the Just Transition Commission. Because, climate change is not something we can do it on its own. It's got to be with the grain of other economic and social change. And just transition, which I suspect Harold will also mention, is an important consideration there to make sure that people don't get left behind in the process. So back home, we're doing a set of engagements right across the country on different sectors, on the power sector and coal, buildings, transport, the oil and gas sector, which is very important in the UK and is a big challenge for a just transition, on land use and agriculture and on heavy industry, and thinking carefully about how people can plan that in a way that will not leave people behind and will be fair to all. So I think that's a big challenge for us all. We're doing very much writing this mitigation report in the context of sustainable development and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I suspect that's a theme that will be picked up in the panel session that's to come. So once again, thank you very much for the invitation for IPCC authors to come here, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what our authors say once they're off the leash and can say what they want. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. So I think I'll just take a minute to introduce each of the panelists here. So Cheng Fei is Associate Professor and Deputy Director at the Institute of Energy, Environment and Economy at the Tsinghua University, and he's also a lead author for the Working Group 3. His research interests include energy and climate policy. and using modeling tools to look at the international climate regime. Harald Winkler is professor at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, and his research interests are in development and climate change. He's also the coordinating lead author in the Working Group 3 report and has been a member of the South African delegation to the negotiations under the UNFCCC. Helene is Associate Professor in Innovation Studies and Sustainability at the Department of Environmental Research at the Robold University, Faculty of Science. Her main research interests are in international climate policy, energy technology, and innovation. Karin Sato is the Frederick C. Hickson Professor of Geography and Urbanization Science at Yale University, and a coordinating lead author, again, for the Working Group 3 report. She is one of the world's leading experts on contemporary urbanization and global change, and her research focuses on the links between urbanization and land use, food systems, biodiversity, and climate change. And Roberto Schaefer is professor in energy economics at the University Federal de Rio de Janeiro and CLA, again, in the Working Group 3 report. His main area of competence is in integrated assessment of climate change and coupled energy economy climate modeling. So as we can see, we have a great panel here with diverse and very complementary research interests surrounding development and climate change, and we're looking forward to hearing some very novel and interesting viewpoints around this debate. So Navroz, will you start with the questions?
Great. So again, from Ritu and myself, we're really glad you could take the time. Before we get started, there are a couple of seats in front, so if people want to move up here, please step up, and please also turn off your phones if you can. Okay, so as promised, we hope to make this as conversational as we possibly can, and so what we've warned the authors we would do is we were going to sort of pose 2 questions in a first round that we would like each of them to reflect on, and maybe we'll just go down the order starting with Tang Fei. And the 2 questions are really these, to take advantage of the geographic spread we have in the room. Could you please just tell us an example of an impactful, successful, perhaps even transformative initiative in your country to address climate change? And can you also reflect a little bit on what some of the key barriers and obstacles are right now towards these sorts of transformative changes? So maybe just 2 or 3 minutes from each of you to set up the discussion and understand in a snapshot what's happening around the world. So perhaps we could start with you, Tang Fei?
Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me here. I think that regarding to the most important initiatives right now China is doing is the shift from a previous command and control system to manage the energy consumption and the carbon dioxide emission towards a more market-oriented emission trading scheme. That, from my perspective, that is the most important progress happening in China right now. China has conducted the ETS pilot in several provinces and built upon those experience gained. And China began to launch the national market, aim to cover 8 energy-intensive sectors. And we will start from the electricity sector this year. So probably we will see the start of this national ETS right now before the end of this year. So I think that is the most recent important progress. And go back to the barriers or obstacles, I think that one of the most important obstacles is the change of the mental things or the patterns, because of the Chinese government used to use command and control instrument to regulate energy consumption and emission. But right now, when you shift towards a market-based mechanism, it asks the government that to reduce their intervention to the market. But how the government consider its roles in a market-based mechanism, I think that could be a possible obstacle. If the government intervene too much, then that may reduce the efficiency of the market. And also another issue is about this investment-led patterns of China, which largely drive Chinese economic growth by investment. in the infrastructures and also in the carbon-intensive and energy-intensive sectors. Whether or not this could be changed in the future also have huge implication on the future's Chinese emission trajectory. So I just stop there to save time. Thank you.
Yeah.
European discussion.
Sure, yeah. I'll talk to my country, the Netherlands. It's indeed a country in the European Union. Just to put things in perspective a little bit, it has 17 million inhabitants, which is about as much as the Delhi metropolitan area. So, but you know, the good news is that recently a climate law was passed, which has a 95% greenhouse gas emission reduction target in 2050, not as good as Scotland, compared to 1990. But the big issue, of course, is how do you implement that, right? It's easy to focus on a target, but the question is how do you make it happen? And in the Netherlands, we like to talk. We even have a word in Dutch for talking just as long as you need to reach consensus. So a process was set up that all parties who had some stake in that target, so employers, big industry, but also environmental organizations and trade unions, talked and talked and talked until they had a sort of a set of plans that together hopefully will reach these targets. So there's a target for 2050 and there's a target of 49% emission reduction, so halving emissions by 2030, which is of course in 10 years, so that's pretty soon. Now these talks were around 5 sectoral tables: agriculture, which is a big sector in the Netherlands, industry, electricity, transport and buildings. And each table came up with a list of measures. Now that was all very nice. The climate agreement it's called, and it translates into a climate plan. It's in addition to the emission trading scheme that the EU already has and various measures that the EU has already taken. The issue was, I think, first of all, political implementation, and secondly, sectoral integration. Because these tables negotiated independently, but if industry wants to electrify in a carbon neutral way, it needs a lot of carbon-free electricity. So that puts a burden on the electricity table, which has to provide a lot more carbon-free electricity, which had troubles by itself already getting carbon neutral sooner rather than later. So that integration was an issue. And then secondly, we work with a coalition government. There are 4 parties in the coalition. They have to agree on it as well. Every party has their own, preferences. There's one party in there that doesn't like road pricing, for instance, but that was one of the agreed measures. So now that was delayed until the next governmental period. So the question is whether that will happen at all. So implementation is a big issue.
Yeah, thank you very much, Navros. So I'm going to talk about South Africa and about the renewable energy sector, both in terms of the greater success and also involved in the barriers. So in terms of, I think, the most successful program, we have a renewable energy independent power producer procurement program, a very long title, but it's essentially meant that through a bidding process, we've gone from virtually no renewable energy for grid-connected electricity in South Africa to about 6.4 gigawatts. That's not very much in India, but for us, that's quite a lot of the installed capacity of about 45 gigawatts. And it's been, particularly in terms of wind and solar PV, it's brought a lot of investment, particularly because it's an independent power producer program, not our state-owned utility Eskom investing. And total investments of about 12 billion euros, equivalent to 200 billion rands, and it's radically driven down the costs, which of course is also a function of what we're seeing globally. But beginning of this process, so wind went down from about 10 euro cents to about 5 euro cents, and solar PV from 23 to 6 cents. So it's now actually cheaper than building new coal on a per kilowatt hour basis. So that's a radical, not yet on solar, on concentrating solar power, but generally that we've really passed a tipping point in that regard. Also very importantly driven not only by prices. We had a feed-in tariff for a while, and it was very important both to have power purchase agreements. This proved to be absolutely essential, which are part of the winning bidders and the auctions get that, and also institutional innovation. That we had an IPP office set up that actually handled this procurement process in a way that was slightly outside of government, and that was that was very important. In terms of greenhouse gas terms, this is delivering about 25 megatons CO2 reductions. Again, for scale, our inventory says we're around 530 megatons, so it's a significant contribution to mitigation. The biggest single barrier that we face, I would summarize in the phrase of political economy. And so our electricity sector has been massively coal-dominated. Used to still, in terms of electricity generated, still 90% of the electricity comes from coal. And some of the labor unions have outright opposed the renewables program for fear of job losses. They have genuine fears of job losses. Have actually taken government to court to stop further procurement of IP programs. That is now politically been resolved. But I would also add that there's been really active disinformation, I think one has to say, in this day and age, and Jim being off the leash, thank you very much, and say that really, so the Coal Transporter Workers Forum came out of nowhere and was blocking roads and the highways to basically demonstrate. There's a really genuine concern. The just transition that Jim mentioned is the discussion in South Africa, how we move from a coal-dependent economy to one in which renewables plays a role, and again, the same phrase is being discussed, leaving no one behind. That is a very genuine concern. At the same time, it's very clear that there are vested interests that are opposing this in the coal industry. And then just the final comment, returning to the slightly more positive side, is now very interesting thinking about actually using climate finance to also help with this to fund an accelerated phase out of coal in South Africa. And I think at the UNSG summit, our foreign minister is basically seeking concessional finance of a large amount, 11 billion euros, that would basically swap out. The key factor there is to deal with some of the debt that our national utility faces. So it's a very complicated system, but I think so in renewables, we are an area of both the most successful program, but also part of the most contested problem which is really political economy.
Great, thank you. Janet?
Thanks, Navros. So I wanted to highlight two success cases and two obstacles. So one success case is, I would say, everything California. So if California were a country, it would have the 5th largest economy in the world. And California has implemented incredibly innovative, transformative strategies to reduce emissions. And one example is that it has committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions within the state by 30% above from 1990 levels by 2030, and it's on target to do that. So everything California is a terrific success case. The second success case I want to highlight is during President Obama's administration, he had a $800 billion stimulus package. And in that $800 billion stimulus package were billions devoted to the clean energy economy. And it is because of the billions that were spent in that green energy economy that the cost curves associated with solar power, with batteries, have come down significantly and over a very short period. So two obstacles. I'm from the US. Need I say more right now? So, but I did want to separate two different things. So one is the Republican Party, and very specifically, the fossil fuel industry and the Koch brothers and their network. It's actually now only one Koch brother. So that's one obstacle. The other obstacle is very specifically the Trump administration. And this is a much larger discussion, but the Trump administration is doing many things to roll back innovations that happened during the Obama era. And I just want to give one very quick example of this. So I mentioned that everything California is a success case. So California has fuel economy standards that are higher than what's mandated at the federal level. 13 other states have copied California's fuel standards. They want to be like California. They want to have fuel efficiency. And the industry likes this because it makes them competitive domestically and internationally. The Trump administration is trying to say that this is illegal, that they must abide by federal standards. So now it's moving into the courts, and it's setting up this very interesting tension between what can be done at the local level versus at the national level.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Karen. Roberto?
Well, good evening. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Thanks, Rito. Thanks, Navrat. I'm happy to come after you because if you had bad news, I have even much worse than that. Well, I come from Brazil, and we have a very interesting situation in Brazil because typically our emissions are 1/3 from the energy sector, 1/3 from agriculture, and 1/3 from deforestation. And if we take, let's say, 2005 as a base year, basically Brazil reduced emissions between 2005 and 2015 by 50%. Why? Because of the important role played by the land use sector. Also because we have a very interesting energy sector. Roughly 80% of all electricity produced in Brazil comes from renewable energy. 70% from hydro, 10% for sugarcane biomass, roughly 10% from wind. So our energy sector is really very decarbonized. Also, when you look into the transportation sector, all cars sold in Brazil today and during the past 20 years are what we call flexi-fuel cars. It's a car that can run on any combination of ethanol or gasoline. So basically, depending upon the price on the gas pump, you choose what kind of fuel you want to have. The reason why we have this kind of biofuels program in Brazil goes back to the 70s because of the oil shocks. At that time, Brazil used to import roughly 80% of all oil consumed in the country. And we had a very, let's say, strong sugarcane industry. And basically, let's say, to move from sugarcane to begin to produce ethanol was a kind of natural thing to do. So biofuels in the transport sector, hydro and wind, and biomass in the power sector explains why our power sector or our energy sector has such a low emissions. Then we have agriculture, and then we have deforestation, which, let's say, between 2005 and 2015, reduced emissions by more than 80%. So this was the, let's say, a case of success, how a country in 10 years can reduce emissions by 50%. So these are the good news. So we make it, okay. Then, similar to what Karen has said, we are in the middle of a political turmoil in Brazil. 2 years ago, we had a president that was impeached, and then the vice president became the president, and then some kind of political bargaining began in the Congress of Brazil, and land was somehow used, let's say, to get the support from some Congress people in Brazil, which had strong interest in the agribusiness thing in Brazil. So somehow, let's say, what happens today is that we have a new president or a new government that was elected this year, which basically pays no attention to the Amazon and then somehow has a different view of the kind of uses that Brazil should make from the Amazon. Because, let's say, Brazil is a large country. In fact, Brazil is larger than the continental US. And 50% of the Brazilian territory is the Amazon region. So, let's say, a different government can have different thoughts about what kind of use you should give to that forest, whether or not you should promote more agriculture, whether or not you should promote more mining. So we have a problem now that basically, let's say, deforestation this year as compared to last year increased by roughly 80%. So basically, we're back to deforestation rates that we had in 2005, which was really a bad year in Brazil. In the case of the energy sector, we also have something curious, which is Brazil is a major producer of oil because we had huge oil reserves found in Brazil some 10 years ago. And basically, in the next 5 or 10 years, Brazil will become this country with the second largest increase in oil production in the world. We're going to be, in the next 5 years, one of the top 5 oil exporting countries in the world. So we have this curious situation of a country that does not rely heavily on oil, but becoming a big oil producer. And then we have now this problem with the Amazon, which is not clear what's going to happen. So good news in the beginning, bad news like Karen in the end. Thank you.
So I think with that, let me go back to the panelists and some of the things they raised, and I would request a couple of panelists to respond to and add to what was already said. So Harald mentioned that institutional changes needed to be made in political economy was a very important factor in pushing things in South Africa. I mean, how was this done? If you can elaborate this a little bit further, and if any of the panelists can further add to how this has worked, not worked, in your own countries or regions.
Sure. So what I was referring to, so in this renewables program, that was a bidding program, historically, when you're trying to run a program where you're trying to get a lot of investment in the private sector, and our country is effectively close to broke, so the investment has to come from a private sector. Doing this through a traditional government department, what you would call a ministry, is not very efficient. And so what was set up by our Department of Energy together with our Treasury was technically this IPP office, this institution that was created, was technically under the Department of Energy, but significantly staffed by staff from our National Treasury. We have a very different way of engaging with the private sector, and it was also established as an agency outside of the formal government department or ministry, physically also. And it created confidence of investors significantly, I think, I'm not sure about this percentage, but I think about a quarter was foreign direct investment, but 3/4 was domestic investment. It created confidence that there was a place in which, in a competitive bidding process, where government would say, we want this much renewable, sometimes by technology, and you bid on price, you bid on cents per kilowatt hour, and as I was telling you some of the numbers, how that radically drove down the costs in South Africa. The confidence of private sector investors to collaborate with this, to put their bids to such an agency was high, and it's been, so that is a key institutional innovation. I'll add one other thing was there was also a requirement which shifted that the IPP project developers had to make a very significant contribution to socioeconomic development, and that's another story. But in terms of the institutional innovation, that's what I was referring to.
Would anybody want to add to that in terms of your own opinion?
In terms of political economy and that sometimes opportunities arise, I think the Netherlands is also a good example of that, because for years and years, the Netherlands, everybody thinks it's a very green country, but actually it's extremely fossil-based. And the reason is that like 95% of the energy sector was, until recently, or even 96%, based on fossil fuels. We don't have a lot of renewable energy potential. It was a lot of gas, because the Netherlands has a lot of gas. It has huge gas fields, and it was exporting a lot of gas as well. Now what happened at some point, because of the gas recovery on lands, little earthquakes started happening. And that was sort of swept under the carpet for a long time, until they basically couldn't deny it anymore. That's only a couple of years ago. And what happened then was that there was so much sympathy for those people who had been living with this uncertainty of earthquakes because of gas recovery for so long, that this very strong coalition around gas production, gas use in industry and in the agricultural sector, we have a lot of greenhouses that use a lot of gas, and gas in households, that coalition sort of started coming apart because it was lacking legitimacy all of a sudden. And that provided a window of opportunity, basically a policy window, along with a couple of very hot summers and bad hailstorms that never used to happen, that opened a window of opportunity to sort of agree on more ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets that before that was unthinkable. So this is really something that escalated over the past couple of years, and I think it was sort of a perfect storm, a couple of things coming together, which single-handedly wouldn't have happened, and that then unleashed a number of other measures like closure of coal-fired power plants that had just been built, and really big investments in offshore wind power particularly, which is essentially our only large-scale renewable electricity source. So I think these policy windows are extremely important, and once one opens, right, you need to be able to act on it, because it may just close again, and then the opportunity is lost.
Well, I also can share some Chinese experience on that, especially on the renewable development, because of a large part of that, especially solar PV in China, rely on the provision of the subsidies. But when the renewable scale became large and large, the government have a huge burdens on the subsidies, and that is a large amount of gaps, and that delay the provision of the subsidies to the solar PV company. But because of that, the renewable company is generally very capital intensive, and half-year delay of that subsidies create huge problem for them. They can't just running their business. That is a very important issue in China in the previous years. But one innovation, I think, which is very interesting is to consider this use financial approaches. There is one innovation is to package the whole project because of you have the long-term contract with government. Although the subsidies will be provided a little bit late, but those future cash flow can be use as assets and then package the whole project in the asset market, use future cash flow to provide the today's spending. So that's kind of how to use the financial market as an innovation approach that to reserve this political economy of this delay of the provision of subsidies.
Innovations on the success, and I just want to offer an innovation that leads to barriers. So we think about rollbacks of environmental laws, and if you close an environmental office, it's very obvious to the public that you've done something really bad. So I think one innovation that this administration has done is instead of just closing environmental offices, what they have done is they have taken an environmental office that's located in Washington, D.C., which is our capital, and they've taken 200 jobs, and they've relocated them to literally the middle of the country, to Kansas. And most of these people don't want to move to Kansas. So it's been this relocation innovation to basically reduce the capacity of this environmental organization, a federal agency. It's very innovative.
Well, thank you for that, Karen. It's a creative destruction of a different sort. Maybe we want to sort of move to another round, but I would like to just press in particular, Karen and Roberto, on one aspect. We've just been through Climate Week at UN and the General Assembly. Many of us have seen videos of Greta Thunberg and the social movement that's emerging, especially around young people. And when you see the entrenched political economy that many of you described, including Helene with coalition governments and so on, but most vividly, I think, Roberto and Karen, can I ask the question, do you see, when you look at popular politics, do you see in both these countries any sorts of indications that popular politics and sentiment around climate change, as opposed to around issues like Helene described with earthquakes or air pollution in China, around climate change per se, that would get strong enough to serve as a counterbalance to these kinds of more problematic national formal politics? Do you see any indication of that looking at public opinion surveys and so on and so forth?
Oh, yeah, this is an easy question. Yes.
Okay. All right. Can you sign?
I have a couple of examples. I mean, one is after the Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Agreement, there was a grassroots movement and an organization that's called We're Still In. And basically now it's a loose federation of more than 2,000 organizations, cities, universities, basically saying we're still committed to the Paris Agreement. And Yale has actually been a leader in the US in terms of trying to get the university to get to zero emissions. Lots of cities are committed to this and organizations. So that's, I think, one example. Another example is a campaign called Beyond Coal. It involves 300 grassroots organizations. It's funded by former Mayor Michael Bloomberg. And Beyond Coal has a campaign to retire coal-fired power plants. And they've closed almost 300 at this point. So bottom up, it looks great. Very positive.
Roberta? Let's say, if you had made that question to me 6 months ago, I would be very positive like Karen. Let's say, in fact, let's say, historically, the public opinion in Brazil have been very proactive, very concerned about environmental issues and climate change. This is what we used to be used to. So, but then what we begin to see now, let's say, we have a government that's beginning to retaliate against universities, research institutions, beginning to cut funding for education. And somehow it seems that, let's say, young people, students in general, some are, to some extent, a little bit afraid of what's going on. This is one thing that's very negative. There is a second point, which is the new role that social media begin to play. So, let's say, the issue of fake news these days are really impressive in the case of Brazil. Even, let's say, we're beginning to see some groups, even in universities, discussing the issue whether or not the Earth is flat or not. This is for real. We're beginning to see, let's say, fake news say, okay, the Earth is flat, climate change is a big mistake. So, in this new environment, let's say, it's not clear, let's say, what's going to happen. Let's say, I used to be very optimistic because I've been a university professor for more than 20 years ago, and I think the real, let's say, I really think that the new generation is going to change that. The problem is that the old generation still have some 10 or 20 years ahead of time. So perhaps in 20 years, Brazil for sure is going to be a much better country. But this transition that we are going through now is a very difficult moment. So I used to be very optimistic, but at this point in time, it's not clear. People are not going out to the streets anymore, which is something very unusual. And even, unfortunately, the government has been stimulating that students film their professors on what kind of things they are saying in the classrooms to eventually retaliate afterwards. So this is, so today when I give a class now, I ask my students not to take, because you never know what kind of use this can be made. So again, this is very surprising to a country which is the fourth largest democracy in the world. India is the first one, US is the second, Indonesia is the third, and Brazil is the fourth one. So I think democracy is the way to go, but when you have fake news, when you have other things happening, even democracy sometimes goes, let's say, in the wrong direction. So this is very dangerous, and I'm really surprised to see what's going on now.
So I think at this point, we open it up also for 2 or 3 questions from the floor. So please feel free to very briefly ask a question. Do not go into long dialogues. Yeah, and then we'll have a second round, which is more thematic for the panelists, and then open it again for questions. But right now, I spot a hand here.
So this political economy discourse has been important in this whole climate development and energy space. And across like development and developing countries are moving towards more and more RE. So I would like to know from Harold and also from Chinese scholar about how do you basically see, because like we have been facing as developing countries and as emerging countries, there are different challenges which has been faced in terms of institutions and other things. So is there a common thread that can be kind of built together and And also from Helen about what is about the developed countries of the world. How does political economy in this perspective play around it?
There's one there.
Question at the back there, Madam.
Maybe I can just stand up. This has been really great, and I just wanted to ask. In South Africa, you had said that you had set up basically an external, outside of government body to help with basically bringing in new innovations, essentially, to the energy sector, right? And you put it outside of the Ministry of Climate Change or Forestry or whichever you have in South Africa. So I think there's maybe a similar challenge here in terms of getting investor interest in India, because often the government feels the pressure here, I believe, to lead on innovative projects, but because of the way that bureaucracy functions or the way the funding is tied, it's hard for them to leverage funding in a timely manner, and so then investors often, like I work in the sanitation and water supply sector, and so we've seen many case studies of people just kind of, investors losing their interest because they're just not getting timely payments or timely payoffs. And so I wanted to know how you made the case, or like how that organization made the case to your government to be a separate entity, and how you set up that regulatory framework to get started.
This one here.
Yeah, right. No, right here. Right here, right.
Thank you, Navroz, and thank you, Ritu. Particularly glad to see the gender-balanced panel here. I don't know if it's by design or by accident, but it's good to see after a long time. Quick question. India is a country of people, right? So I have a 5-year-old and I have a 65-year-old mother also at my place. How do I explain IPCC or climate change to people and have them drive it? Very simple. And maybe examples from your particular countries. That has a campaign been run to that angle, how from an outreach perspective, and how do you get people involved, like a 5-year-old or a 65-year-old? Very simple.
Okay, maybe one last one
might
here
have to get
for
Jim
this.
feedback
Yeah.
up there.
Yeah, one last one here.
Yeah, hello, my name is Nagaraj. My question is to Professor Tang Fei from China. The Chinese government has this huge, gigantic policy of Belt and Road Initiative. Is there discussion in China about the emissions that might emanate from that initiative over time? Because it may not enter the Chinese ledger, but clearly it's going to be in some other countries' ledger over time. So, given the size of the Belt and Road Initiative, is there discussion within China about the extent of emissions that might emanate from this initiative over time?
Okay, so we'll let the panelists respond to all the questions, so feel free to pick all of them or whatever you're comfortable with. Should we start with Tang Fei, or whoever wants to go first?
Yeah, well, I can start from the BRI questions. I think that firstly, that a large amount of the investment in BRI countries from China goes to infrastructure. And most of the infrastructure is carbon intensive. That is why the world concerns about the climate implication of BRI investment. But the first thing I need to say is, firstly, that is not only about BRI, but about how to build a smart infrastructure future, including the BRI investment, because we have about $9 trillion will be invested in the infrastructure before 2030. And how to invest smartly, that will largely determine the future emission trajectory. And secondly, the Chinese investment, in fact, largely involved as the technology provider or the constructor. And according to our study, Review Wisdom, they generally don't have the influence on the technology choice. The host country themselves has huge influence on the technology choice. So the question is, in fact, how to involve different stakeholders, including the financial providers, the local host, the company, the constructor together to decide smartly what kind of technology need to be invested. I think that is a huge issue we should discuss in the next step. That is also not the BRI issues. And the thirdly is we also ask the Chinese investor, including the development bank, frankly, they still not consider those climate risks into their project. We asked them that, have you considered that your investment will be stranded? They didn't consider this at all because of in their model, they only consider the current investment by using a static assumption, means that use the previous evidence that to do the model. And they didn't consider the changing climate, which may have huge impact on their investment, for example, in hydropower. And they didn't consider future emission trajectory. If they go down, will have huge implication on their coal investment. I think that is also issues for the whole financial sector, that how to redefine the risk of their project and how to identify the real bankable project. So I think, although the question is for BRI, I think that is to be broader issues for other financial investors also. Thank you.
Do you want to pick up, Harold?
Yeah, so I wanted to just pick up on two of the questions. So in response to the political economy question, I hope I understood it properly, but my thinking, and this is just really my thinking, is that I think we broadly need to do two things, and I'm not sure they're different across developing and developed countries. I think on the one hand, you need an alliance of change agents, of social forces, call them what you want, getting behind a vision of where we want to go and realizing that vision. And I think, at least in South Africa, it's clear what that vision is called. It's a just transition. You need to move from coal to renewables while not leaving anyone behind. And I think that's starting to happen. The other part to that of building that alliance, I think, and that's the most difficult part, also what other colleagues here on the panel have said, is I think we know now that to solve the climate challenge, we need action by absolutely everyone. And I'm not just talking about all countries, that is true, but also by all actors in society. And what that means is we also need to learn to people who we really fundamentally disagree with, who hold a really different worldview, be they some of the, we have similar divisions in our country of people who think in very different ways. And I think if we don't reach out to those who disagree and who don't want to go this way, and at least persuade them not to resist this, then I think, so to me, that is it's a very general answer, but that's what I can offer. And then in relation to the question about the IPP office and that institutional innovation, again, I don't think there's any definitive answer to that question, but I do think that in this case it was an instance that is fairly rare for us, but that the international climate regime actually had a significant influence on South Africa, and this was even from Copenhagen. Ambassador de Scoopter will remember we only noted in the call, and yet we put a lot of pressure on South Africa to say we've got to do something, and we were looking at renewable energy. The feed-in tariffs weren't working. There was some experimentation. I think that's the second element that was quite interesting around saying, well, it's these standard contracts, these power purchase agreements that are really important. And then I think agency was really important, that the Treasury got involved and had an idea of how you could manage something. And I think the Treasury also had an interest because it was extending sovereign debt guarantees to our national utility, and it was essentially getting to the edge of being able to do that, and in fact is now over the edge, is no longer able to extend any further sovereign debt guarantees to Eskom, our national utility, and so you had to get private sector investment in. Public investment wasn't there, so a combination of necessity and having pressure from climate change, I think, was what I think led to it.
Thank you. Would anybody like to take on the question of how you communicate to a 5-year-old and a 65-year-old? IPCC authors are not necessarily known. If you look at an IPCC report, the complexity of some of the diagrams requires some engagement. So it may not be our native skill, but would one of my colleagues like to take on that important question?
Yeah.
Please, Roberto.
No question was addressed to me, so let me take this question here. I don't think we're going to convince, let's say, a 5-year-old boy or a 65-year-old mother that we have to do something on climate change because of something bad is going to happen in 2100 or 2050. Basically, you have to convince that something's happening today already. That basically, because of climate change, let's say, water availability is already being affected, which has impacts on food production, on prices of food. Or because we need to mitigate, let's say, because of local air pollution, which is something that comes hand in hand, let's say, with mitigating climate change associated with fossil fuels. We're not going to convince someone, let's say, to change the diet because this will help to mitigate climate change in 2100, but because a changing diet may have an influence on your health today. So basically, we have to, in order to show the importance of climate change, we have to show the importance of climate change not because of the problem itself, but because of the co-benefits that come associated with that. And in that case, climate change becomes a co-benefit of something else. Let's say the new climate economy has a huge potential, mostly in developing countries, to create new sectors of the economy. Take the case of, let's say, solar panels in China. Take the case of biofuels in Brazil. So I think in order to make this issue more accessible to everybody, we should try to change the way we communicate and show that we're not talking about something that's going to happen by the end of this century, but something that's already happening today, and the sooner the better we deal with that issue.
Great, thank you, Roberto. I think we're going to embark on just another quick round with the authors before turning back to the audience. And I just want to kick off with a question to Helene. There was an earlier question to Tang Fei, sort of talking about whether the Belt and Road Initiative and the resultant emissions, how that should be counted, which ledger it should be put in China's or somebody else's. And there's this, even though, sort of as Harold said, everybody has to sort of pull their weight, we do have these questions realistically of ledgers. And one of the important issues that has come up in the debate is that while emissions in some of the developed world appear to be going down, if you look at the embodied emissions of goods that are produced elsewhere but consumed in the developed world, then the accounting looks quite different. And so maybe Helene in particular can comment to start with, and anybody else who wants to jump in, to comment on this debate around consumption emissions and what it means for how we count up who's doing what on climate change.
Yeah, not deep in my field of expertise, so with that disclaimer, I think it's a good debate to have, right? Because the drivers of emissions are very diverse and are sometimes outside of territorial boundaries, and that is exactly what these consumption-based emissions are addressing. Also, especially in the developed world, my personal view is that consumption has really become part of the problem. It's just there's no stop to it. And there's not even climate change is a stop to it because the emissions of that consumption are elsewhere according to the current systems of accounting, which is problematic, of course, especially as long as emissions aren't priced elsewhere. And even when they're priced, the question is whether they're priced enough. So I think it's a very good debate to have. Increasingly, we see numbers coming up, and indeed it shows exactly that. There's definitely a gap there. It depends a little bit on the country. My own country actually produces a lot as well. I think it's roughly in balance. There is definitely a footprint, but there's also very high emissions in the country, so it sort of balances. But I think it's a good debate to have. It does, and it's also, especially in the developed world, links the debate to the question of GDP growth and how much of that is necessary and what is needed in order to have a fulfilling life. And whether at some point it is enough, and there's enough to be had. That actually does link back to the earlier question on the political economy, because in every country in the world, including in my own country, there are deprived people, or they consider themselves deprived. Of course, the dimensions of that vary quite a bit across the world, and they would. What they see as their entitlement to consumption patterns and emission consumption patterns, even when those emissions are happening elsewhere. And that really complicates the debate because that also affects eventually the public support for measures on deep reductions also in developed countries. At least that's what I'm seeing in my country, but also, for instance, in France with the Yellow Vests protests, which are still going on at the moment. So it's, I think it adds another flavor to the political economy debate on climate change, and really changes things around, and I'm not sure where the outcome there is, and whether it's actually beneficial or not for eventual support for climate change mitigation measures.
Karen, I wanted to come back to you. So you talked a little bit about cities and how some subnational actions were already successful, but if you can elaborate on that, but also can these subnational actions, cities, regional efforts, can they compensate adequately for national action in the US? What's your take on that?
Let's hope that they can. And I'll just give you an example, to give a very concrete example. So we are in the middle of the biggest urban transition the world has ever seen. Every single day, if we aggregate all the new urban areas that are being built around the world, it equals to about 20,000 American football fields every day. That's 20,000 American football fields are being built into cities and urban areas every single day. We're adding about 1.3 billion urban dwellers every 10 days. So the size of this urban transition is enormous. And there are two very different potential mitigation strategies. There are strategies that are available for cities that have already been built, that have already been established, like the New Yorks, the Delhis of the world, Shanghais. And then there are very different mitigation strategies that are available to places that are building, that don't have the infrastructure in place already. I'll give an example in the US of a strategy that's relatively new, just implemented last year. The city of Minneapolis is the first city in the US to get rid of single-family, single-use zoning. So in the US, most cities have single-family zoning, which means that one piece of property allows for one house. And many people call this urban sprawl. I personally don't like the term, but basically it's single-family and that's it. And Minneapolis last year outlawed it. Basically said, well, we're not going to have single-family zoning. You can have multiple houses on a single lot. And that has actually become a mitigation strategy because you're actually allowing more people, more density. But there's densification. But the other thing that it's allowing for is more commercial activity near where people live. And so you're allowing for more convenience and walkability. And so that also reduces emissions that come from transportation.
Maybe I could just, I think that's a great example. And would anybody else want to sort of comment on either some of the subnational action that's going on, or regional city level work that's going on, or maybe action sort of in partnerships across state and non-state actors in other parts of the world?
Can I comment on that?
Please.
Let's say this is something new in the case of Brazil. Let's say for the first time we're beginning to see, because what's going on at the federal level, some states, some cities begin to think about taking their own actions because they think this is the way to go. So this is very new. So let's take the case of the state of São Paulo or the city of São Paulo, even the city of Rio. They're beginning to think about taking their own actions because they believe that they cannot wait anymore for the federal government. So this is something new that's happening, which is very much, let's say, try to mirror a great experience that we see in the US, where you have some states beginning to talk with each other and decide to go in one direction that eventually may even conflict with direction of the country as a whole. So I think this is something very positive, and we're beginning to see that as a reaction with the inability of the federal government to really do something.
I have another example. In the US, there have been more than 150 cities that have committed to 100% renewable energy. 150 cities said, we're going to only have renewable energy in our city.
Great. And one more aspect which I think we are clearly missing is that of innovation and behavior change. So Helene, can I ask you to start with that and say something about how this can be usefully adopted? Maybe the case of Europe, if you can bring that in.
Yeah, so again, in the Netherlands, there are multiple examples. There was actually, so in the Netherlands, we eat a lot of meat, I have to admit. But a couple of months ago, there was a news release that actually the sales of meat had dropped by 9% over 1 year to the next, which is like amazing. It's really a lot. And that's nice in itself, right? And hopefully it will continue. It's mainly because of people, maybe health reasons, or because they became more conscious about climate change, because there's a lot of attention to it. But what it will actually do, there's also a 50% rise in the sales of meat replacements, like tofu and tempeh and those kind of things. So what will investors do? In what market will they invest? Will they invest in the shrinking meat markets or in the growing, fast-growing meat replacements markets? And where will the innovation happen? Right? It's usually in a growing market. So hopefully, something like that can set up like a cycle that is a force for good. And also very much second what Karen was saying about basically urban planning or whatever, however you want to call it. In the Netherlands, cycling is a great example. We cycle a lot. It's a flat country and the weather isn't great, I have to say, but for the rest it's pretty cyclable. But the reason why it is cyclable is really a conscious policy decision. And usually cities are planned in such a way that you get from A to B quicker by bike and in a safe way with separated bike lanes. And that's just an infrastructure, an urban planning thing. And that makes it attractive to cycle. It's just quicker than taking a car. And it's healthier and it's carbon free. It also means there have to be bicycle repair shops, right? And there's now electric bikes so people can bike longer distances, and when they have a headwind, they don't mind so much. So there's a whole infrastructure and economy building around this cycling. But it had to happen with a decision to build the infrastructure to make it happen and to plan cities in that way. So it's a combination of social, technological, and institutional innovation that always happens.
One more question to you was on the transition away from coal. I think that's a connect which India and South Africa probably have. And we have this whole talk about job loss. So what's your take on that? How is South Africa likely to handle that? What is the discussion there in terms of jobs and what might happen to those?
And if I might just add to extend that, so that there's part of that is a coal transition story, but the broader story is all the changes that we need to make have to be consistent at least in many developing countries, with a rapidly growing population of working age, and we have to generate jobs, certainly in India, to keep up with that growing population. So I think the job story more generally and what it means, the pressure on jobs in many countries and what it means for a low-carbon future would be wonderful to get reflections on.
Well, I think I can only really share reflections on the problem statement, not offer any solutions at all. But these are the policy priorities in South Africa. We've not had a national development plan for very long, since 2011. But the top priorities are poverty and unemployment, poverty and inequality. We have a Gini coefficient. We used to compete with Brazil, but Brazil has now gone down during the days. Still 0.63. Official unemployment of 29% and unofficially 40%. In some rural villages in the Eastern Cape, 90 to 100%. If you graduate high school, you are not going to have a job, almost certainly. So these are the absolutely binding constraints, as they're called in our discussions. And we do have a minerals energy complex, coal dominated, that basically has massively dominated our economy and not just our energy sector. And so the challenge for us now is in energy terms to move from coal to renewables and energy efficiency and all the things that the discussion, which I think is similar to India. China also has a very large part of coal, as does the US. But really, I think it comes back to, again, the just transition. What is going to happen to not just the workers in the coal-fired power plants, that's often what we focus on, but in the coal mines, we turn coal into liquid fuel and downstream. And there are whole entire communities you can go to in the Mpumalanga province, who's living in a shocking environment with terrible levels of air pollution. Maybe not by Delhi standards, but maybe approaching Delhi standards, I'm not sure. I think we're here at a good time of the year. Acid mine drainage, all kinds of things. But essentially, it's making a plan to make this transition that we have to make for the climate and leaving no one behind. How are we going to do that? That is the conversation about climate change in South Africa at the moment. And it'd be good to have that conversation with other countries, with Scotland and various others.
Any of the other panelists like to just come in on this question of jobs and employment before we turn it back to the audience?
Everywhere, right? I mean, no matter, everybody wants a future for their children, future employment, and it's an issue everywhere. And people like to keep things as they are if they're good. And yeah, that's a big concern in the U.S. as far as I know. In the Netherlands, yeah, it's employment and perspectives for the future. If you talk to your mother about the future for your son, I think that's an entry point for a conversation about climate change, and what will that future look like, and that's the choice we have right now.
Great, thank you all. Let's open it up to the quicker and more precise you are, the more questions we can get. So let's start from the back of the room there and work our way forward, and then move over to this side. So at the gentleman at the back there.
So I'm going to try and ask a pretty general one about communication and framing, considering the title of this event we're having today. What are countries doing to mitigate climate change? Considering we're aiming at around 3-degree rise in 2100, this has an effect on public opinion if we are using this kind of language. Why are we actually not taking some sort of drastic language and starting to talk about a looming or an existential, ecological, and climate crisis, and not just this soft-sounding climate change? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe over there, and then we'll come to this side of the room.
I just had a question to pick up off of the conversation on behavioral change. One of the things that we have to also consider is the aspirational aspect of it. Especially if we're talking about the urban poor and getting them involved in the conversation on climate change, how do we then also approach the idea behind aspirational ideas of development, especially in terms of consumption?
Okay. All right, why don't we finish with this side of the room, and then we'll do a second round over here. So yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Rahul, and my observation is very simple. I am not a scientist. I am a sociologist, but a human being. From an ordinary person to a powerful person in this world, they're feeling the pinch of a climate change. There is a danger, there is a threat to every one of us. Despite of that threat, there is a left and right politics in all over the world on the issue of climate change. You must have seen on the TV screens the Swedish girl who was passing through the same terminal. Trump did not even look at her because she has taken so much, and there was a very critical article recently published against her in Mint. Mint, it is a newspaper in Delhi being published in Delhi. So my only observation is that, and I would like to know from yourself, any of you can give answer to that how this issue of left-right politics on such a very, very important thing, which is affecting every one of us, from your perspective of your country, how it is happening over there, we are feeling the pinch in India, but in your country, how you feel like that, and what are the remedies you think you can propose to the respective governments? Thank you so much.
Thank you. And the last question at the back there. Last question for this round. We'll do a second round with this side.
I've been seeing some recent figures that indicate that if you looked at the NDCs of China, US, India, and the EU, that leaves no more carbon space for any other country to reach 1.5 degrees. The obvious question is, what is the equity question here? How is this even? Is this even figuring into national conversations within your own countries? Does this even appear as a motivation to try and do more, or does this not figure in your national conversations about what you determine to be your contributions?
All right, let's just maybe start with Roberto this time and go across, and please pick up questions that you'd like to respond to.
I'm going to pick up the first one about language. This is somehow what I was trying to say here, that let's say the IPCC has been very successful in producing very rigorous scientific documents, but I'm not so sure that has been successful in translating that into a language that can be appropriated by policymakers and or the public to really understand the urgency of the problem. And this was exactly what I was saying. If you continue to show messages talking about 2100 and 2050, this is not going to work, and this will not going to show the urgency of the problem we have now. So I think I totally agree that we have to change the language, and somehow we're beginning to do this in this AR6 cycle, let's say. That's why, let's say, we're not talking about climate change only anymore, but the issue of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are now walking hand in hand with the issue of climate mitigation, because it's very difficult to justify mitigating the climate if you do not take proper attention to other issues like, let's say, jobs, air quality, health, water. So we're changing our, let's say, language to better represent that. I'm going to pick the final one about the NDCs. This is a real problem, let's say. The IPCC has been relying heavily on what we call integrated assessment models, which are, let's say, normally least cost optimization models that find, let's say, a least cost solution for the globe, showing what would be the strategies for you to mitigate. And then when you do that, you're using a mathematical model that does not look at these problems of whether or not we have a kind of, let's say, sharing of the efforts between the different economies. That's why you have to understand that, let's say, the result of those models are only an indication of what would be the optimum solution and the least cost for that. And by showing that, we can show that developing countries will need to have, let's say, international investments or transfers or funds to do things domestically that's optimum for the globe, but not mandatorily are optimum for them. And then we begin to have this conversation of a fair sharing of the effort, which have to come together with, let's say, investments and help so that developing countries can do their part in the globe, taking into account their own development priorities.
So I have a colleague at Yale who's the director of the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. And his team has found that if we break the climate change issue down away from just being a left and right, a black and white issue, that there are many gradations of how people feel about climate change. And it's not, so earlier I said part of the problem is the Republican Party. That's definitely the case right now. But it would not be fair to say that Republicans in general don't support climate change action. And in fact, his work has found that this goes back to what Roberto was saying, that the messaging has to link to how people are experiencing it today or
our current
children. The 2100 doesn't really make that much sense in terms of thinking about climate action. In the U.S., my colleague has done a lot of research working with farmers and in the middle of the country, and has found that if you talk to people about their experiences, especially with farmers who are very, very attuned to longer-term weather patterns, talking about climate change in the context of increasing variability and increasing unpredictability, that we actually can't, this is not just climate change, it's actually an era of weird weather. So we're now in September, no, it's October 1st. 2 days ago in, I think it was Montana, had a massive snowstorm. October 31st, 4 years ago, we had a massive snowstorm, massive, unusual. And I think giving these examples of what the impacts, or examples of the effects of climate change, the unpredictability, the larger variation, I think helps people understand it. And there's many more people that support climate change action in the US than simply saying that it's a black and white issue. But absolutely, the messaging is really essential.
Thanks. So I'm going to pick up the question of the carbon space is one we've been discussing for a long time. And I think what's important with that, absolutely true, what I think your question said, but I think we need to think about equity and inequality both internationally between countries, but we also need to think about them internationally within countries. And I'm speaking from a country, as I said, with the highest inequality in the world. My carbon footprint is not very different to my colleagues from the US or China or Netherlands, or maybe different to Brazil. But, and certainly I think we need to think about that a lot. I think that we need to speak not only about poor countries, we certainly need to continue speaking about that. I think that's absolutely essential, that the world is not divided into two groups of countries, but it is also not homogeneous. But we also need to think about that there are poor communities and poor people. I think Aline was making a point, even if it's in more relative terms. In many countries across the world, there's certainly in India, many rich people, many middle-class people, and many hundreds of millions of poor people. So I think thinking about that is very, very important. And at the end of the day, the remaining future carbon budget, the carbon space, is so vanishingly small that we are increasingly haggling over such a small amount. We certainly are not giving up on equity, and I think we need to be it needs to be essential that remains part of how we understand implementing the Paris Agreement and the NDCs and all the things we're talking about. But I think we need to think about it also. We also need to look within our countries.
Yeah, I'd like to link to that point as well on equity. So I was a part of the special report on 1.5C, and one of the results of that is that mitigation pathways and adaptation in line with 1.5C goes hand in hand with the Sustainable Development Goals. At least there are way more synergies than trade-offs. But another conclusion was it really matters how you do it, and that's really where equity comes in. You can implement 1.5-degree pathways in ways that are inequality increasing, and you can implement them in ways that are inequality decreasing. So the path that you take is very important. So in that sense, institutions matter, agency matters, and how people relate to their aspirations and see their role as a world citizen also matters. I have to admit, in my country, it's one of the highest income countries in Europe. We have a fairly good life, I will say. And people, I think, are generally aware of that, especially politicians, that we have to act first, basically, because we're richer and have more capabilities than other places. And we've used up our carbon budgets 3 times over. But at the same time, local politics, it's very easy to ignore that. That's also the reality, because everybody cares about their own little area first. And if you tell them, well, we are emitting 10 times as much on a per capita basis than the average person in India, they say, yeah, but my problems are here and right now, and they are also real, right? It's the painful truth that happens in every country, I'm afraid. So yeah, I'm trying my best, personally to put that on the agenda locally, but it's not always working, I have to admit.
I also picked the last question on the carbon space, but from another perspective. Use China as a case that before the Copenhagen, in fact, it is traditional thinking, Chinese policymakers, they think the bigger the carbon space, the better for the future development. But after Copenhagen, I think that kind of thinking totally changed. And they don't think that the carbon space is a necessity for the development of Chinese economy. And some of the Chinese policymakers, in fact, consider it should be introduce some international pressure to force the change of the Chinese economy. And they believe that could be the right way to do. And also, that kind of equity discussion also linked with the local government in China because of, you know that we have a command and control system, so they allocate the national target to different local governments. And when they allocate those kind of target to local governments, what happens in the international negotiations really also happens within this national allocation. The local government also refer to the CBDR, the common but different responsibilities, and they ask for different treatment among those different goals. So the equity is also a concern within ourselves, but some of the local policymakers also recognize that to commit to higher ambitions could deliver some changes that in their economy. So you can see that some provinces and cities in China, they do commit themselves to early peaking, much earlier than the national peaking target on 2030. So I see that there is a change of patterns and thinkings in China on the carbon space and equity.
Take a few questions from the side, and then we'll let the panel respond again. So starting at the back, yeah. Can we get a mic behind there?
How many centuries of data support the view that it's changing? To really have a sound conclusion, we would need several centuries of data. But what we've actually got is just, say, 100 or 150 years. So that is, I think, the reason that skepticism sometimes arises. So that's my point. How many centuries of data have we really got on this issue?
One here and one here.
What is the scope of local government's efforts? There is a mayor's agreement, mayor's covenant on mitigation. So how mayor's agreement, how mayors have played the role in mitigation?
Okay, one here behind.
Yeah. So my question is, how are supply chains addressing climate change? How are supply chains addressing climate change? I understand that many of them have global commitments, the MNCs, and how much of them are actually tackling the ground levels?
My question is very, very futuristic, especially to China and USA. I don't know Russia is here or not. See, I've been reading about the use of helium, which is not radioactive. And in case we go for the good space program collectively, all the big countries are bringing the helium to the Earth. It will solve our energy problems. It will solve our this climatic problem at a very fast rate. Maybe 20 years down the line. This is my question.
Okay, one last one with Dr. Parekh here.
Did I understand correctly that you say that the carbon space that is available doesn't matter? I'm sure if you have a 2-degree target or a 5-degree target, the carbon space available is larger and the cost of a country's development could be better and even more equitable and more prosperous development can take place. So it isn't quite right, it seems to me, to say that it's a 1.5 degree. You can grow equitably fine, but the growth rate would be limited. But if I had a much higher carbon budget, I can again grow equitably, but I have a much higher average consumption and development pattern.
Should we revert back to the panel? And Roberto, do you want to start?
Let me pick the first one because I think it's more interesting. Let's say, more than 120 years ago, Sven Arrhenius from Sweden published a very interesting paper showing that it's very trivial to show that some normally 3 atomic molecules absorb radiation in the frequency of the infrared. And so it's a very easy thing to show that more carbon emissions lead to higher temperatures. And we have a very good, let's say, balance, or we know exactly how much fossil fuels have been burned in the past 100 years. And then, let's say, also we have very good historic measurements of carbon dioxide concentration and also some measurements about temperature. So it's not that difficult for you to build a model and also, let's say, to collect what was the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere a couple of thousands of years ago. If you go to the glaciers and then you collect, let's say, ice that were deposited year after year. So we know how the atmosphere looked like 1,000 years ago, 2,000, 5 years, 6,000 years ago. So by knowing that CO2 absorbs radiation, and by knowing how much CO2 we had in the Earth 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, we can very much reproduce well how the temperature has evolved over time on Earth. What's new about it, let's say, and now we have very strong evidence, is that the real climate change we're seeing now is something that is happening very fast. So we're not talking about the temperature today is much higher than it were perhaps 100 or 200,000 years ago. This is not a problem. The problem that we know for sure that never we had such an increase in temperature in a short period of time. This is the problem of climate change. About, let's say, the other question about supply chains, I think, let's say, since most countries here are market economies, as public opinion begin to better understand the implications of climate change, then companies are beginning to adapt to that reality because it's good for their business. So also, let's say, somehow, even if a company is not very much interested about that, if they know that their consumer is interested on that, they're going to adapt to that. Finally, about carbon budgets. You're right, let's say, but we don't have a choice anymore. Let's say, the 1.5 special report has shown that a world that's only 2 degrees, let's say, warmer is much worse than a world that's only 1.5 degrees warmer. So it means that we really have a much smaller carbon budget. And the issue here, and we discussed about the, let's say, the political economy, this issue of inequality, is how to better allocate what's left in terms of carbon budget to allow development or more development for those countries that need that. And eventually, for some countries, really, development has to move to a different stage.
I'll take the mayor's question. Cities occupy about 3% of the Earth's surface. It's a very small area on the planet. But urban areas contribute to about 70, 73-ish% of greenhouse gas emissions from final energy use. So if you think about that, it's an incredible, efficient, territorial space to govern or to mitigate climate change. And there are many efforts at the local level to mitigate climate change, whether it's Covenant of Mayors, C40, ICLE. There are lots of different efforts. I talked about these 150 cities in the U.S. that have committed to 100% renewable energy. Another innovation that we're seeing very quickly in terms of just the last 5-ish years is bilateral climate-smart diplomacy between cities. So in Minnesota, there have been a number of cities that have engaged in bilateral diplomacy with German cities to learn from these German cities to really accelerate climate change mitigation across borders. So I think at the urban space, this is where we're seeing transformative strategies and really innovative strategies. Mayors are proving to be very, very nimble and very responsive to their constituents.
So I want to come back again, Dr. Barik, on carbon space, and also I think there was an earlier question related to the urban poor, and which I want to address in these remarks. So absolutely, I mean, the carbon space is relevant, but certainly what I'm saying is that it is relevant between countries, but I think increasingly also we need to look at it in countries. And I think also as Teng Fei was saying, and I come back again, that for us in South Africa, this is a conversation about the just transition. And I want to say a little bit about that, firstly at a personal level, right? So if I think of a black woman living in the rural Transkei, a rural area in a poor village, her carbon footprint is going to be much, much less than myself as a rich, white South African living in Cape Town. And I think that inequality is also relevant to what really the just transition needs to come up with, and the conversation that is happening in South Africa, effectively in the end is about a social contract. And in simple terms, in my sense, I want to make also very clear that social contract includes lifting the poor out of poverty. Lifting the poor out of poverty does not blow the energy budget, it does not blow the carbon budget, and that is absolutely necessary. It also requires, and Helene was referring to this, that rich people need to learn to live well with less, and the aspirations of the middle class need to change not to live like the rich are currently living. And if we can put that together, then I think that's a fundamentally different way of also discussing equity and justice.
Very much, yeah. I'd like to address maybe a little bit of the supply chain question. I think supply chain, I mean, they're a blessing and a curse at the same time, right? Because it can work in very good ways for climate change mitigation, and it can work in bad ways. The bad ways being, that sometimes customers, especially in industry and primary industries, are very remote from where most of the emissions are taking place. We as people caring for something are not buying steel, right? We're buying a product that is a couple of steps away from where steel is being made, and that's where most emissions happen. So that there it's really hard to use supply chains in a good way. There are also, globalization in that sense, and innovation has globalized, and that has one particularly really beneficial thing as a consequence, and I think that relates to solar PV. There was also a question about that. So costs of solar PV have dropped spectacularly, which is one of the most hopeful things, I think, in the climate mitigation debate. And I think we have two countries to thank for that, Germany and China. Germany and China. Germany for having very generous support and policies to create a big market. It's a big enough country that there was a market. And the German electricity consumer paid for that. What happened then, and that wasn't really Germany's plan, is that Chinese producers responded by innovating much more quickly than German producers of PV, which was, of course, it was an industry policy, right? The idea was that German consumers would buy German PV panels. They didn't. Eventually, they bought Chinese PV panels because they were much cheaper, and they supplied similar quality. And that sort of interaction between the German markets and basically a failed industrial innovation policy and the Chinese producers stepping into that void drove down cost tremendously. And then everybody thought, okay, this is really an attractive option, and then cost came down further, and we are now in many areas, PV is the cheapest way to generate electricity. So in that sense, a globalized innovation system actually helped bringing costs down, and it's actually a hopeful story. So there's always various interpretations to whether value change and globalization and innovation have a positive effect or not.
Yeah, I will address the last question on the carbon space. I think that the IPCC assessment report, especially 1.5, is clear that 1.5 degrees much safer than 2 degree. Of course, that if you ask for 3 or 4 degree, you can have larger carbon space, but that will sacrifice the impact of climate change, and that will largely offset your benefit of development. So I'm not sure whether the 3 or 4 degree is something we should pursue. I say probably that is not. And the second issue is in fact, that is a challenge for developing countries, because generally the rich countries right now that they bring 300 or 500 million people into the rich or more developed world. Right now, especially for China and India, we need to bring 3 billion people into that, but we only have limited resource space. That is the right line. So, but that doesn't mean it is impossible. We should not sacrifice development, but we still can identify options within this red line, and we should identify a low carbon pathway that to achieve this goal of development together with the climate goals. I think that is the work of IPCC Working Group 3 to identify that kind of transition pathway and to accelerate our ambitions toward that pathway.
Great. Thank you very, very much. Before I hand over to Ritu to conclude, I just want to again reiterate our thanks to all of you for the comments, not just on technology, on institutions, on politics, but also on a vision of a just future, which I think is really an important, larger framing for this conversation. So thank you all. Just 2 more quick thanks. I just want to acknowledge and welcome very much the presence of our colleagues from the Ministry of Environment and Forests and Climate Change here. They've been very supportive of us holding this event. But much like the IPCC itself, they have no responsibility for our remarks. But thank you both very much for being here. And I want to definitely acknowledge our colleagues at CPR and Terry, Mandakini and Sonal in particular, and many others in support of them, who have helped organize this event and create an environment that is stimulating and conducive for this conversation. So thank you both and your colleagues very much. So over to Ritu for a last word.
No, I will not try to summarize anything, and I will just add my thanks to this great panel. And we've heard a lot of interesting insights of very diverse kinds from across the region. So I will not stand in between the panelists at this point, but again want to thank all of them, as also the wonderful audience we've had today. With that, I think we just close the panel, and dinner will be served outside. So do join us, and the panelists will be available also to just chat with you and answer any further questions. So enjoy your dinner with food for thought and food for action.